How's it going, guys? It's Floyd and Bongs here again. And glad that you guys could join us. So, the first two videos, we were sharing our stories and our vision and what led to this movement, or this channel rather. And now we're starting a series. We're very excited about it because of just really the things that we've been wanting to have be exposed to people, to actually know about God. So for us really to uh, just be able to share the information that we're learning about God is just an exciting thing right now, particularly because of the information we have. So we want to start a series called Our Origins, or the Faith, or the Origins of Our Faith. And it will be in different parts. So we'll have, now we'll talk about the origins tracing back to where do we see the African people, or prominent African people, God using them to do big things in the Old Testament. And in the second video, we'll do one where we're actually talking about how God used African people, or just the heavy presence of critical events in history as far as God's story that happened in the Old Testament in Africa. So, man, it's really exciting. That actually is just an overwhelming experience of seeing just how much we reach in the Bible,
Mm,
like the events that happen. We don't start far. I don't need to look at what Einstein wrote. I don't need to look at what someone might have said 500 years ago. Like it's recorded in scripture. So it's
mm,
just an assurance, man. I think for us as Africans, to really be challenging even the narratives that are not helpful,
mm,
narratives that assume that this faith is a European faith. Not that we're
mm,
saying we're monopoly on it, but that
mm,
narrative doesn't help because it assumes that Christianity came to Africa through white people,
mm.
and which isn't necessarily true. And hence, we're creating this video to show you guys where this actually all started, and where we can actually trace our genealogies back to. So that's encouraging. I think that is encouraging, and we're
Yeah.
hoping, man, that we could help shape, we could help change those narratives, and remove the lies, and let's instill some truth in it,
Mm,
and hold on to those that we would teach the next generation truth. I think it's interesting to see even the commentaries of PhD people,
mm,
how misleading they've been. Great scholars, some you've even quoted in your pulpit if you're a pastor listening to this. Just the shocking discovery of how they've missed this important aspect of it, just how rich Africa is in light of this faith. So we're
yeah.
excited. That's what we wanna point
Mm.
out. Uh, that I mean, we could see this flesh itself out here. So man, it's exciting. As long as you can add on to that.
Yeah, that's good there, Floyd. And I think we can look at historically the narrative that has been told about Africa. You know, um, we read history from school, and a popular concept about our continent was that it's a dark continent.
Mm,
That's what I grew up thinking about Africa. It's just dark continent, and we needed some people to come and bring about light, in the continent. So historically, the narrative has been that, and I think we can even look at now, even in the modern times, that narrative has just gone on and gone on, bruh. And most recently, what happened in Kenya, for me was just shocking. A pastor who supposedly Jesus, came back and he's at Kenya. It was very interesting for me why, Jesus comes back and he's white. He's white, with blue eyes and, European origin. This is very interesting for me. So you see this narrative being perpetuated that actually this whole Christianity and faith thing is about Europeans and white people.
mm,
And again, as you said, man, we're not trying to hate or shame, but really want to bring again that balance. That balance
yeah.
to say, man, God has been using different people of different ethnicities, The Bible is multicultural. God has always been multicultural. There's always used different nations to advance his kingdom. And so
Yeah.
particularly we want to look at the presence of African people, right? The presence
Yeah.
of Africa and its contributions, I guess, in seeing through the plan of God, in the world. And so as Floyd mentioned, we're gonna do different parts. And so today we're gonna start with the Old Testament. And so
Yeah.
we wanna trace some of the involvement of African people and how God was using them. And then I think afterwards, Fred, I think we will spend some time just talking about the importance of that and some of its implications for us today. What does it mean for a black South African Christian today, knowing this knowledge about
Mm,
this presence of African people in the Bible? What does it mean
mm,
for you? And so, yeah,
mm.
maybe Fred, you can just take
Yeah.
us through.
Yeah, man.
What do we see, man, in the Old Testament? Like,
Yeah.
are there black people there?
It's overwhelming. I think the just the entire book is just overwhelmingly rich in African history, man. I think actually what they should do when they're teaching African history, they should just literally go to the Bible.
Mm.
Because I think it's the best
Yeah,
it's probably the best
yeah,
place to start. I think it's probably the
right
best place
there.
to start.
Yeah.
Then there's other lives that they
Mm,
have us learn in our history classes. But I think I
mm,
have some interesting facts that I want us to start with. And this is interesting. It says Egypt is mentioned more than 700 times in the Bible.
mm,
And yeah, I mean, when I was reading, I'm like, I mean, is it the same Egypt or maybe there was another Egypt
mm,
somewhere in North Europe somewhere? And I was like, it's the same one, clearly. And then there was a Cush or Ethiopia. You could either use other words like Negro or Niger, um, or Nubia, depending on the translation. That is mentioned more than 60 times.
mm,
And that specifically references the origins of dark-skinned people in
mm,
Africa. So there's man, it's insane
mm,
or how rich we are in information. And I was just thinking, I'm like, actually, this the Garden of Eden.
mm,
You see when God Garden of Eden is supposed to be the source of all life,
mm,
and says to flow with these rivers that provide that life and sustenance.
mm,
And the regions are mentioned, different regions, and one of the regions is
mm,
Cush.
mm,
And further scholarship has mentioned where that it is the Mediterranean, the Nile River, and all those expressions. But like the source of life of all living, from Garden of Eden, like we
mm,
do have a source of life flowing from it, uh,
mm,
and this is supposedly where the tracing of the word Kush or the Kush people from this region comes from. So
mm,
that's an interesting thing. And another one is Israel. So when we think about the Jews or the
mm,
Israelites or the Hebrews, we generally tend to think about how it looks like in the 21st century, where it's generally white people with those small things here at the top. And I mean, when you ask people, hey, I mean, with the black Hebrews, sounds like
mm,
abomination. Um,
mm,
but when you understand that the Hebrew culture of the people of God was not so much, yes, it started as an ethnic thing, but it wasn't so much ethnicity that bounded it,
mm,
because we learned that it's a very multicultural community, um, but that it was more based on the faith. So people who belong to Yahweh would be those who would be associated within the 12
mm,
tribes of Israel. And the example of this with the Cushite people, I'm going to bring in just now. The Cushite, which is really meant, it's either Ethiopia or meant dark skinned people, is they were involved in all of this history that I'm telling you
mm,
guys. So some of them we see them in First and Second Kings being involved in the army,
mm,
and give a bit when I talk about the Cushite woman with Moses. But
mm,
some of them are mentioned as fighting alongside David in wars, and then some in Psalm 8 and Psalm 7 is known
mm,
as the prayer against a Cushite who was a Benjamite. Uh,
mm,
Now, it's a black man, part of the Benjamin tribe. That's what it means.
mm,
And here, David is praying to God about this person. I think there was an argument or something didn't go right, so he had brought
mm,
that to God. And then there were Cushites who were also enemies of Israel. So you had black people on all spectrums of this story, heavily involved from the beginning. And I
mm,
think this is a great picture of God showing, even in the major prophets like your Isaiah, showing how God is bringing all people to Himself, all nations
mm.
to worship Him, and this becomes fulfilled in the New Testament through the person of Jesus. So
Yeah,
I think that, yeah.
that's that's big for me. I mean, as you're talking about the Kushites, and obviously you're gonna get into it. I just thought of a resource that maybe if people wanna check out some of the stuff that you're talking about the Kushites. There's a book called "Wonderful Ethiopians of the Ancient Kushite Empire" by Drusilla Houston, and I mean he touches on some of the stuff that you're saying about the involvement of Cushites even in these nations that almost constituted this Hebrew or
Mm-hmm.
Jewish, tribes or nations. And so, I mean, that in itself is huge when you
Yeah.
think about the fact that Cushites are black and this is who they were
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the empire and their involvement. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it changes something about just the narrative of whether Africa is a dark continent
Yes.
or not.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're gonna go into it, man. I,
Absolutely, absolutely, man. Yeah, yeah. So I think let's start. So we'll talk about five key events that happen
mhm,
in the Old Testament. Like we said, the information is very overwhelming. So
mm,
let's start with Abraham before we get to Moses. Let's start with
mm,
Abraham. So we know the story of Abraham. He gets called out by God, and then
mm,
God gives him his promises, and He says, "I'll make you a great nation, and through you, all these other nations will be blessed." It
mm,
starts in Genesis 12, and it's 11 or 12 somewhere there. So it starts there, and then he then marries woman Sarah, but Sarah couldn't give kids, or she
mm,
couldn't bear children. So Sarah eventually was they had a servant called Hagar, who was an Egyptian woman, an African Egyptian woman. So
mm,
she was a servant, and during the time it was normal to have a servant be taken into marriage, with one of the sons or the kings.
mm,
So Sarah's like, no, you bore children for me, and through that will be my offspring indirectly.
mm,
And through that Hagar gave birth to Ishmael, and then Ishmael then receives these promises later on. So you have Ishmael before Isaac, who was born now from Sarah, who is the son of the promise. Um, so Abraham, there's a situation in which Ishmael is not liked by Sarah through an event that happened, and
mm,
then they're cast out with Hagar. So Abraham is not happy about the situation, and God is like, no, don't worry. I'll make Ishmael a great people as well. People from his side will multiply the same way they would with Isaac. And we see that becoming fulfilled with the 12 prince,
mm,
and within those tribes, like God continued fulfilling that promise, and it started there, just with that woman. So I think we we could easily read that story and we continue like nothing just happened,
mm,
particularly
mm,
still in a world where it seems like it's a bit of Africa has to do a bit of apologetics classes as far
mm,
as is this our faith or not. And now we're talking about Abraham, who is we know
mm,
the promise was given to, in which today most of us would claim most of those promises saying they're fulfilled in our day and age. And we know that part of that, uh, Abraham married an Egyptian woman as part of that part. And it
mm,
doesn't start there. That was one instant of it.
Mm.
And I mean, I think it's like an encouraging, sobering thing. We go to another
Mm.
interesting
Yeah, I don't,
story. Yeah,
wait,
yeah, yeah.
before we move on, I mean, we're talking about Abraham, and then, I mean, you've mentioned the promises and who he was. I mean, it's big. He is a big figure in the whole faith narrative, and even it's interesting that the promises that you're talking about, ultimately, we see them, coming to fruition through the Savior Jesus.
Mm,
It's like there's a line there from Abraham to Jesus. I think it's
mm.
interesting that the guy who was, through his offspring was going to fulfill that, married an African woman. And so
Yeah,
their line has some African blood, in them. Yeah, I thought
yeah.
that was,
That's pretty. Yeah, that I like the
yeah,
way you put it, bro. It's
yeah,
quite an interesting one. How God literally was
yeah,
working in that entire story.
yeah,
And then we have Moses. Moses, the
mm,
high priest. We know his story begins immediately after Genesis. Um, and I mean, Bones, you share a bit about, I mean, just the where he was rescued and who rescued him. Um,
mm,
but what's interesting in Moses becomes the high priest. He becomes the person who mediates between Israel and God. He's the only person at this point in history
mm,
who's able to connect with God, and he knows
mm,
the heart of God. And is a guy that we now know the commandments of God and the heart of God through his work, through him. So God used him.
mm,
So he wasn't a small figure in the faith.
mm,
He was a big person. So there's an event that happened in Numbers 12 that involves his sister Miriam and his brother Aaron. So Moses marries a Cushite woman in Numbers 12.
mm,
And there's ramifications so there's an altercation uh,
mm,
between Moses and Miriam because there seems to be a tension between as to why Moses is marrying this woman. And God takes it seriously that he then curses Miriam with leprosy. And
mm,
obviously leprosy was a big disease then. It meant you would be cast out of the people, you'd be left to die alone in isolation. So God
mm,
does that as a result of that altercation. But it's interesting, the commentary or the commentaries of scholars who have PhDs argue or associate the Cushite woman or just that tension with Miriam to assume that that lady or the Cushite woman was a slave.
mm,
Um, and which is misguided because that is not even the context of what the Cushite people were known for at the time.
mm,
Um, in actual fact, I think it that at the time the Kushite people were known to be of higher class. They were generally known to be soldiers, as we'll see with most of history. As I mentioned in First Kings and Second Kings, you see their prominence there. You see them a lot in the prophets as well.
mm,
So they were prominent bold people, bold men, and they were involved heavily with trades with Israel later on in the story in the Old Testament. But they were never, not even once, were they recorded that they were of inferior race or inferior class.
mm,
However, what could be seen in the story is that Miriam is actually worried that that type of ally would damage him because he's marrying up. So you
mm,
know how we say today you're marrying up, meaning the standard of the person you're marrying is much higher than you. And it could also pose a military threat because if these guys were great and they were soldiers, that means they could
mm.
attack you if there was issues. So there's a lot of association which was not the same way in which we interpret it in the 21st century.
Yeah.
I think understanding the history of the Kushite
Mm,
and their place in history helps us understand why that tension could have been the case there. And I think it's important for us to also just pause and think about. I mean, that is first instance where it seems you would think it's an abomination to have
mm,
someone of different culture marries into another culture and which is used in the 21st century as an abomination thing. But
mm,
that God affirmed it. And
mm.
it happened to be a high priest who would be seen as the Holy of Holies married an African black woman.
Yeah.
Um, so, I mean, I think, yeah, yeah.
That's that's big, man. I think for me, just what you said there about Moses, marrying up, like so the tension with Miriam and them was was not like what you're saying was not Moses. Why would you marry a slave?
Yeah.
which will be like your modern narrative. Why
Mm,
would you marry a slave? But it's like, no, bro, why would you marry above you? Why would
mm,
you marry above you? And so I think what you mentioned, the interpretation, one, you see the, yeah, as we mentioned, the narrative that, Africa is this dark continent, barbaric and nothing to contribute. And I think some of it, Africa being known for slavery and all that stuff, and some of those interpretations, I truly believe, are influenced even by the thought process.
mm,
So as soon as you see a Cushite or a black woman, you're thinking a slave, you're thinking that continent, you're thinking nothing to give, you're thinking, but like it was completely different. It was completely different in the context. Actually, the Cushites were like, you know, powerful. They were have a lot to contribute. They were, amazing. So I think that's crazy to
yeah.
me, man. That even
And
the narrative about who black people were at the time in the Bible is completely different from some of
mm,
the narratives that we have,
mm,
today, and some of the
mm,
stuff that maybe black people even struggle with. Whether you refer to complex identity crisis, but the
mm,
truth
mm,
of the matter is the God of the Bible who made you, orchestrated events in such a way that that's not how he sees us. That's not how the narrative is being told, even in his word about
exactly.
about who
Yeah.
about who we are. So
Mm,
it's just interesting. Again, but for me, I mean, it's amazing. We're talking about Moses here,
yeah.
freeing the Israelites from Egypt. Such a significant event in the whole story of the faith, and the
It
fact
is.
that he
Yeah.
married a
Yeah.
black woman, man. You
Yeah.
know?
No. I think it's definitely interesting work, and I think it's fortunately it gets even better,
Mm,
because there's more incidences like this that happen. But I think just as a reference to maybe how people could be asking, how did the Cushite woman get there if the
mm,
were just came out of the great
mm,
Exodus, and this was for Israel. How did she get there? I think it's a bit helpful to ask that question, and I think Exodus 12,
mm,
towards the end of it, will give you an answer to that. That there
mm,
were amongst those Israelites, there were other people who, like
mm,
again, we said the basis of you being a daughter or son of Yahweh wasn't just your culture and ethnicity, but just
mm,
your faith system overall. So there were people in Egypt who came out of it, out of with the Israelites, and became part of their family of faith
mm,
as they came out into the wilderness. So that is where we could trace the Cushite woman's links
mm,
from. But there's before we go further,
mm,
Phinehas, which is an interesting one. I want us to talk about Joseph.
mm,
So Joseph, we know, is the prototype would use in the circles prototype of Jesus, or this Jesus-like figure because of his obedience towards God at a young age, and how his life literally just turned out. So now he was sold with his brothers. So he was sold by his brothers to into slavery in Egypt, and he got into a lot of trouble that he wasn't guilty of, and he was in prison, and then just the whole story. I encourage you to read mid Genesis towards the end to
mm,
get a story of that. But eventually, he had favor with God, and God gave him favor in Pharaoh's eyes, and he climbed up the ranks. And as he climbed up the ranks, he became an important person
mm,
in Egypt at the time. And Pharaoh gave him I think one of his daughters to be his wife. Now Pharaoh, for those like if you didn't hear what I said, he was in Egypt, and Egypt
mm,
happens in Africa. Now you have
mm,
a Joseph, a Hebrew of Hebrews, which we understand will form part of the 12 tribes later on of Israel, like in Exodus already. So you have someone like Joseph marrying into a different culture altogether, and he happens to be marrying an African woman. And
mm,
through that, they have two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. I think no Manasseh, sorry.
mm,
And they become a big feature into the distribution of land in Joshua. So they
mm,
form part of a geographical location which was then known as an a place in which there were people groups coming through. And God used a multicultural, multi-ethnic couple to do that. And it
mm,
wasn't just like other like normal people. It was a member of the Israelite family, like first off being a son of Jacob, um,
mm,
and just seeing how God even used that story, and where the people actually end up in. Just that again, thinking about that Abraham lens, like your people will be,
mm,
um,
mm,
like just the fulfilling of that prophecy, bit by bit. We're seeing another hint of it through the story, um,
mm,
and then we have Phinehas in
mm,
who's a high priest, similar to
mm,
Moses, who's a high priest out of the family line of Levi. Um, Now he was a grandson of Aaron.
mm,
Phinehas is an Egyptian loan word meaning the Cushite, um,
mm,
or the Nubian or the Ethiopian,
mm,
um, or the Negro. So that word Phinehas literally was saying, "Here is our high priest, the black man." In short,
mm,
Lord.
mm,
So you have early stages of the story of the Bible. You have this black person that God puts in this Levi family to take care of his people as far as the spirituality is concerned. Now he becomes a mediator. It's
mm,
interesting um,
mm,
because you didn't just necessarily become a high priest unless God had ordained you,
mm,
or unless you were in a different line, like the Levites, for example, who would have that type of role. But I think it's interesting that one of the guys I was reading a book from, he was saying, imagine if instead of using Phinehas, they use the word Negro to translate that when they put it
mm,
in. Imagine how that would have affected
mm,
the racist leaders who started transatlantic slavery.
mm,
And I thought that was, I mean, that was a deep thing because this Panay
mm,
has become a prominent member of this community of faith. We see his events in Numbers when the people had disobeyed, they'd fallen into worshiping idols, and then he becomes one of the
mm,
people to pay revenge to the Midianite,
mm,
and then he gets commemorated in Psalm 106 as saying he was a righteous person because
mm,
uh, the acts that he did credited him as righteous. And there's a promise after that. And further on, similar to Abraham, his generations to come would be blessed. Now you have, I mean, you have this person who just walked by and read that story, and I think it was interesting because when I first
mm,
read, like, what does Phineas mean? Until I read it later and more intent, I realized that it actually meant a black person, and I'm like,
mm,
it created much more meaning because understanding where we are exact today's age, where you have a lot of scholarship that is whitewashed, and by
mm,
whitewash we mean a lot of black history is now deemed to be a result of white civilization. Um,
mm,
like the idea of Egypt being the civilization of the time of the Bible is seen by other commentaries as saying no, that had to involve European people because it was foreign to have people like Cushite maintain a place at the time. And I mean, I'm telling the truth that people who have written a lot of books are saying this type of things because of their narrative of how they thought the Kushites would be, at least in their understanding.
yeah,
It could be conscious and unconscious as well,
yeah,
but the bias is clear. So yeah, I think, um, I mean, that's a big one. When I think about history, grandson of Aaron, we remember who Aaron was a
yeah,
brother to Moses, and Moses marries a Cushite woman.
mm,
And I mean, it goes back, and you're seeing how diverse this family is becoming,
mm,
and
mm,
the center doesn't become so much the ethnicity, but who they're worshiping. And I mean,
mm,
it's rich. I think it's rich. And then you have um, the last one, the prophet Zephaniah,
mm,
son of Cush. It
mm,
says, it doesn't start far from verse 1.
mm.
It says itself. This is, when you write an introduction to something and you're
Yeah.
introducing yourself. And then, yeah, it says, like, this is Zephaniah, son of Cush, and then it gives a genealogy,
Mm,
like 4 generations back, and it traces its genealogy back to King Hezekiah, who was known to be the David kingly after David's time, who treated people righteously and who knew God. So this prophet is said to be son of Cush, which is assumed again is that
mm,
if you were to look at him today, you'd be able to identify why he was called the son of Cush.
mm,
It had to do with traditions, but association of the people with certain region as well. So when someone said, for example, no, you look like you are a Tswana person from this place. That
mm,
the way they would address you would be associated with that geographical location.
mm,
Um, and that's a similar way in which this looks like. So this is a prophet again,
mm,
who's, who's born and is giving, is rebuking, Israel is rebuking Judah in this case and saying you're fallen away from God, as a rebuke, and then later on an encouragement to say no, God is going to
mm,
redeem you, and is going to make you a great nation as well,
mm,
and
mm,
other many people will come in to know Yahweh. So again, you have this person that God used as a prophet to tell a story of God and of the promises similar to Isaiah, similar to all the other prophecies
mm,
of this is how I will redeem people. And Isaiah is interesting because it goes into much depth because it was during the time when there was like Assyrian war, and then you had Israel, and then you had Egypt in between, and God is saying, I'm going to redeem all the people all the way from Cush. It says
mm,
specific all the way from Cush,
mm,
up south and then up north in Assyria. I'm going to bring all these people back to me. So
mm,
it's interesting in that story that again we see the heavy influence of this geographical location. God is saying, I'm going to bring in all my people from all of those people, all of
mm,
those places, and
mm,
Africa happens to be one of the beneficiaries of that. So I think it's
mm,
humbling, man. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot to take in, but I think it's humbling when you think about um like issues of identity, like who are we
mm,
as particularly because I mean during Israel, God used Israel because it was one of the lowliest of lowliest, and God used them to show His strength within other nations.
mm,
And during this time, the narrative was opposite. Like Egypt was not a lowly place.
mm,
Um, Cushite people were not lowly people.
mm,
Um, so God was using just he has always done that. Even how Christ lived his life, like he's always gone with the lowlies to humble the rich or the thing. So I think it's interesting that even like in the beginning world, God used people who in 21st century would be seen as lowly to
mm,
bring it to himself. And I mean, just the reality that I think we'll also talk about in the New Testament. Like the gospel then goes in from Africa, it goes in now to Europe, um, and now we'll later on know America and all of the world. And in
mm,
the 19th century, there was a narrative that I mean, Africa received Christianity,
mm,
which the truth would be Christianity just merely returned
mm,
through a different form. It was never an issue of it never existed there. So
mm,
I think that would be a correct depiction of it. But God is interesting, had used Africans, and through that, He had reached other nations. And through that, He's reaching everyone
mm.
involved. I think it's an humbling. Um,
Yeah, no, it's big. It's big, man, Floyd, and thanks for this. And for me, as we tracing these different figures, these names, men and women, who are from an African descendant, that for me is huge. Like it really makes the whole argument of our faith being a European thing like so void, but like non-existent, because it's like no ways, the Bible itself would not even agree with that statement, would not even
mm,
agree with that argument, and so for me as an African, it says to me, man, like the whole, like God's word, God's narrative, it's part of my heritage.
yeah,
Like,
yeah, it's crazy.
to trace the ancestral, like African ancestrals, like we have ancestors in the Bible, man. We have
Mm,
ancestors, and that's part of our heritage. And so if I agree to the whole notion of Christianity being a white man's religion, I'm actually denying that. I'm denying my very, heritage. I'm denying that whole history from Abraham to Zephaniah and them, like
mm,
until really the promised Messiah, like all these
mm,
events that are taking place, man. I'm denying that. I'm saying God, that's not true. God did not do that. Yet His
mm,
word actually shows that no, He actually did. He used, people of African descent. That's huge, man. It's a huge encouragement to me. It's empowering. It's empowering to know that actually, contrary to popular belief,
mm,
about who Africans are and what society tells us and systems and structures, like actually, there's a God in the Bible who affirms my blackness, who
mm, mm,
affirms who I am, and he has shown biblically in history, he has used people who look like me. He has used people who look like me to advance, his kingdom.
mm,
So it's a lie, man. The whole European thing is just a lie. It's
yes,
whitewashed, and I think part of the mission, man, for our generation as black South Africans who are believers, how do we help our brothers and sisters, man, to realize, don't, yeah, it's not true. Don't buy into that lie that the Bible or the whole narrative of faith has nothing to do with you. Like, don't buy into that. That's not true.
mm, mm,
God said to Abraham, man, I'll bless all the nations. I'll make the nations great. Whoever will believe in me, I'll bless. And
mm,
as you traced for us, like you see this multiculturalism happening all over the place. God
mm,
using people of different nations and ethnicities and cultures to achieve whatever that He's achieving. So the whole narratives of man superiority and inferiority are just lies created by a system and structure that wants to maintain superiority. And I think
yeah,
we need to take that back, man, and we're very fortunate that, man, the God of the universe who created all things actually affirms us in that. Affirms,
mm,
affirms this narrative, affirms, this identity in Him. And so
mm,
Africans can believe in God. Africans can trust in this God. It's not a
yeah,
European God. It's not. That's not true. The God of all nations and all ethnicities, man. So
mm. That's
it's
big, Bongs.
empowering. It's empowering to me, man, to know
It is,
that
man. It
God
is.
is for us. God is for us,
Mm,
man. And
mm,
there's a heritage, to prove that even biblically. Um,
mm.
so yeah, man.
That's good. That's good. Once yeah, thanks for bringing that, man. It's like this is our heritage as Africans. So you either choose it or you
Mm,
don't. But you can't say no. If for example you chose to worship a different spirituality, and you say because I worship this God, I'm less African. I think that would be
mm,
a heresy saying, because we have seen how rich uh, this book is within this continent.
mm,
So I think, yeah, man, like what you're saying was an encouragement. And I mean,
mm,
yeah, guys, I mean, stay tuned. We're gonna have a second part of this, which is tracing the origins of Africa in the New Testament and
mm,
beyond. So it's exciting stuff. We're really excited about this because it's really liberating, and it's based on truth. So I want to encourage you guys. I mean, take this information, go check it up. We've
mm.
given you guys some basis as to where to look those things up, and let us know what you guys think. So the next session will be on unpacking the New Testament in light of tracing the origins of African history. So yeah, man, you guys
Should
stay tuned. You guys stay tuned, and we'll be in touch soon. So you guys have a good one. Cheers.